Greetings, I'm Dave Gilmore, and this is Design Intelligence. Welcome to everybody. We're so glad you're here. Thank you. And I want to thank particularly Kimball International, who has served as our sponsor for this particular event this year. We are thankful to Kimball. It's important that we receive their backing and their sponsorship in this. A fantastic company. I hope that you will take the time to go to the Kimball International website to see the amazing things they're designing, the amazing things they're manufacturing and providing to our marketplace. A few housekeeping items as we begin. We've had a bit of an agenda change if you have it in front of you. One of our speakers, Daryl Condon from HCMA, has had to drop out of our agenda first thing this morning due to a family medical emergency. And our best wishes and thoughts are with him and his family, but it has created a big change in our agenda. Let me go through that with you as you're logging on now. We will hear from Dr. Mostafa starting at about 1:15. We will then hear from Ana Pinto da Silva and Dr. Jonathan Salk at 1:50, and then we'll take a break at 2:30 for 15 minutes. At 2:30 to 2:45, we'll take a break, which means we'll just step off of our cameras for a bit, and then we'll reconvene at 2:45, and we'll run all the way until 3:30 with our friends at Bala Engineering, and then we'll transition over to Dr. Amy Bartles at 3:30, and we expect to close our time together in this SuperCast at about 4:15 this afternoon. So hopefully that works for you and your schedules, and off we go, right? So amazing things are happening in the world, as we all know. There has been both awful and wonderful that's been occurring over the last couple of years. Certainly, the pandemic was a shock to all of our system as it rolled in early 2020, and as it continued to roll through the year, disrupting so much and causing us to have to pivot quickly into new constructs of working and thinking and behaving and interacting with one another. And that has had a twofold outcome. Number one, it has been traumatic. It has traumatized children. It has certainly traumatized seniors. It has created dramatic trauma within the working environment, people, parents who have been really challenged over this period of time with children and how to work with them in a more meaningful way going through life. And then, of course, we've watched educators being dramatically impacted by this time. It has just been remarkable. On the flip side, on the good side, we have come to a new reality that how fragile we are, that we're not bulletproof, as one might say. We are a people who are in need of one another. We have learned that the criticality of human interaction, physically, being able to shake hands, being able to hug a neck, being able to break bread together, share a beverage together, is so critical in physical proximity. And we're learning the preciousness of human life through this period of time. It has truly been a trauma that the world has gone through. I would say that what's so interesting is the waves of trauma. Wellness is a term that is used regularly, but inconsistently. Its use has, like many other terms, become distorted through promotional messaging devised to trigger some transaction of sorts. When we consider the pre-2020 wellness of humans to this current state in 2022 and our wellness, we're immediately confronted with a contrast on several dimensions. Socially, economically, relationally, physically, emotionally, we can see these waves of trauma that have hit us as individuals, as communities, as a nation, as the world. And these traumatic waves that have swept across societies, both near and distant, have left their mark. The theme of this year's SuperCast is entitled Wellness Expressed in a Traumatized World. Our guests for today come from different places, different backgrounds, different disciplines, and certainly different perspectives, but each is focused on wellness. All are unified around the common call to a new responsibility as the designers, the educators, and the shapers of the world that we live in. I want you to buckle up and be prepared to dive deeply with us into this uncommon content. Our time together is not for the faint of heart or for those seeking an entertaining experience, anything but. We're gathered here to learn, to be challenged, to reconsider. This is a serious subject, and you are serious professionals. And we're honored that you've set aside this time to be with us on this most meaningful time with Design Intelligence and the Design Futures Council. I flew to Philadelphia yesterday, arrived, and am now, thankfully, the folks at Bala Engineering have given me a place in their studio. So I think it looks good in here. I hope you do. They did a wonderful job of setting me up and giving me lighting for our time together. And it is, we're just down the street, not too far from Villanova University. We're excited about these folks having a monumental celebration of their firm tomorrow, and I'm thankful to have been asked to come and speak at this time. As their president just recently said to me over lunch, we're going to get together with 200 of our greatest friends and celebrate. So looking forward to that time. But as I sit here and I come into this place and I see dozens and dozens of engineers from different disciplines in electrical engineering and mechanical engineering and structural engineering and in digital engineering, there's so many that are gathered in this place. I am filled with hope, a hope that is focused on a new wellness, a new approach to wellness in the world. All of us have a responsibility to bring that forward. I'm particularly pleased that our first speaker is Dr. Magda Mostafa, who is speaking to us from Cairo, Egypt at the American University. Magda is an architect. She is a scholar and an educator. She focuses on autism and inclusive design, currently leading autism design at Progressive Architects and teaching as an associate professor of design at the University, American University in Cairo. She's the author of the Autism Aspects, which is really wonderful, a design guide in this space. She recently developed the world's first autism-friendly university design guide at Dublin City University. She's amazingly published her work. She has recently exhibited at the 2021 Venice Architectura Biennale. She has done amazing work, and we're just couldn't be more delighted that Magda has joined us. And I'm in the Eastern time zone, she's in the Middle Eastern time zone, and so we're going to see how we can come together and say hi. It's good to see you.
Hi, Dave. It's nice to see you too.
Now, so where do I find you? You look like, are you home?
I'm home, yes.
What time is it now?
It is 7 p.m. Hello, Luis. I just got a message. It's just after 7 p.m. So it's a nice end to my Wednesday evening.
I am so impressed by the work that you do, by the way that you think, how you take your thinking and you turn it inside out to apply to human lives. And we at Design Intelligence have been going through some of your work and are just like, if you're not in this space, you don't know this space. And so it's really challenged us to reconsider how we look at the human experience within design, of being hypersensitive to light and sound and movement and space and closure and entrance and exits and all the different pieces and parts that you've given your life and your career to. It's extraordinary. Why this, Magda?
Well, I was just asked this question the other day, two reasons. Practical reasons, that I was asked to design a school very early on in my career and found no guidance to design this school for autism. There was nothing. This was 2002, and that date is very significant because it was the time where you were reading the headlines about the autism epidemic. That was just really us understanding what autism was and what it needed. So I dedicated my doctoral research to finding those guidelines and working with autistic individuals and families and schools to test in real life classroom lived experiences how we could design in a way that was more conducive and helpful and supportive of childhood learning. And that was now 20 years ago. And I've been working in that space ever since. And the second reason is very personal. My mother, who we lost to cancer, speaking about well-being and health, we lost her almost exactly a year ago. And she was a teacher and a scientist and dedicated her life to thinking about how she could always be in service of her students and pushing both the educational space, but also the physical space to make sure that all kinds of learners could find a space in the school where she taught and where she led for decades. So it's a very personal mission, but it's also a very practical mission that there is just such great need.
Fantastic. Well, you have some slides that we are hoping you're going to share with us that
I will
guide us through. So I'm going to defer over to you and let you share your screen and rock and roll.
Sure. Thank you, Dave, so much. And thank you for your great and kind introduction. And it's interesting, when Dave and I first met and spoke almost a month ago, and he presented this concept of well-being, and we decided on the title of my piece to be Wellbeing Through Diverse Eyes, specifically the eyes of the autistic experience. And I'm going to talk a little bit about my reflections over the past couple of years, triggered by the pandemic, of course, and consequently what has happened since and the instability that has happened since. But that moment that began almost 2.5 years ago made us all think about our experience in the built world and how we were all, as Dave said, traumatized, how we were all more anxious moving through space, how some of us were excluded from spaces and experiences, how our relationship with healthcare and health spaces changed, how our unnecessary or unessential healthcare was being deferred and the anxiety that happened there, how we occupied spaces with social distancing and our crowd anxieties. And it occurred to me in reflecting on that experience that I and everyone else was living, that a lot of this aligns with the experience of many vulnerable individuals on a daily basis. And autism is one of those populations that on a daily basis can feel vulnerable in space because of the sensory environments that we have created. And that spatial anxiety can be excluding. And perhaps you were talking, Dave, about the silver lining of all this trauma. Maybe that silver lining is giving us a little insight into what it is like to feel vulnerable in space as a result of how we build and design our environment. So I'm going to share with you a few slides, just thinking about that problem from the point of view of autism. So recently there's been a lot of talk about human-centered design and user-centered design. And I think that's a great movement in our field. But one of the issues that I find problematic is that we do not quite agree on who that magical person is at the center of that human-centered design. And typically over the past decade, at least with the modern movement, that has been informed by Le Corbusier and the modular and the international standards and just standardization, code compliance, best practices that are wonderful in many ways, but also limiting in that they only assume this normative profile of an able-bodied, 6 foot tall, male, hearing, seeing, moving, neurotypical individual. And we know that the reality of our human fabric is very different, much more diverse, much more textured than that singular model that really isn't as common as our design standards would have us believe. And that diversity also is nuanced even further by being intersectional. And this beautiful graphic by the artist Mona Chalabi assumes this graphic experiment that if New York City were 100 people, 68 would be people of color, 37 would be immigrants, 19 would live in poverty, 11 would have a disability, 14 would be 65 or over. That number doesn't add up to 100. So you see that many of these identities actually overlap and intersect. So many people are more than one thing, and every one of us is more than one thing when we think of these very diverse categories. So that texture of our human fabric that is so diverse is also further textured by the intersectionality. And to operationalize how we think about this, there's a lot of terminology that we use as designers, like the concept of inclusion. And one of the things I've been reflecting on is that kind of semantic positioning, because the problem with the word inclusion, as noble as its intent is that it assumes a group that is excluded that we need to make efforts to include. So inherently built within it is this othering that I personally have a problem with, because it's assuming an other that we need to make efforts to include, as opposed to really looking at this from an equitable, equal stance. A really great construct I was engaged in last year when I was at the Chicago Architecture Biennale talking about this same topic. The theme for the Chicago Architecture Biennale in its last cycle was the available city. And I found that term really very appealing because it's democratizing. It thinks of our cities, our spaces, our built environments are something that is available to everyone to access in the ways when it is designed well that can potentially be accessible to them. But it's equalizing. It doesn't have that othering that the word inclusion brings with it. And at the center of this, I've tried these past few years to not only focus on how we can design best for the autistic user or the autistic experience, but also what are the benefits of looking at space and design through the autistic lens, and how can that be generalized to the larger population to alleviate stigma around autism, and also to cross-pollinate the benefits of thinking about design from different perspectives. And just very quickly looking through how we have evolved in thinking about disability in general, but specifically around autism. And again, the sympathy, empathy terminology you see on the slide is part of this human-centered design movement and the design thinking movement. But about a century ago and earlier on from that point, we always looked at disability from this medical model of sympathy, of that a person has a problem and needs to be cured. And there was a power structure and a hierarchy to that there was us and them. Yes, there was sympathy from one group to the other, but that way of thinking is just very outdated now. And we've moved past that highly medicalized model, particularly when you talk about autism. Later on, we moved into the functional model where we were talking about abilities, and we looked at concepts like rehabilitation and so on, but that also assumes a certain norm that people need to be brought into, or a certain skill set that people need to be elevated to. And it still has that othering built into it. More recently, we started engaging with disability through the social model, which talks about that society and the environment is the problem that needs to be adjusted with the autistic or the disabled person's need in mind. So we need to become more expansive in our society. And that's where the empathy comes in. But a lot of times what we really mean, or what people really mean when they say empathy, is actually sympathy when you unpack it. Where we are now in the autism field is this concept that came from Damien Milton, who's a psychologist, that he calls double empathy. That is about the relationship between the autistic and the non-autistic experience. And I've pushed that a little bit further. And I actually think in my work about autism as expertise. And in that model, you look from the perspective of a disability and see what that experience brings that can potentially benefit and make broader access available to everyone. So that's just kind of where we're at in the evolution, the social evolution of how we think and engage with disability. So all of this came together recently, a few years ago, with the publication of our Autism Aspects Design Index, which is a framework. I call it a framework. It's not really a code or a standard, but it's a framework of 7 principles, lenses through which, when you think about the built environment and architecture in our spaces and cities, the hope is that by thinking through these lenses, you can become more sensitive to the needs of the autistic user. And currently, Aspects is being used in a whole bunch of different ways. I have some resources that people can read about a little bit more, but I'm really happy to see it being adopted all around the world, across 5 continents. There are projects, there are schools that are teaching it in its studios. There are architects that have adopted it in their own work, whether it's for autism or for other populations. And we've had the privilege and honor to be working with so many different partners and people who have hosted us and collaborated with us and discussed this issue with us. So what are aspects and how do they relate to the built environment? So the 7 principles, the first one is the principle of acoustics. And when you look at the autistic experience, lived experience, often acoustics is the very first thing that becomes part of the conversation. I remember one mother, when I was first surveying needs, responding to a very long academic survey with 3 words when I was asking what matters in the built environment for your child. And she ignored all my questions and came back with 3 words: acoustics, acoustics, acoustics. And in her mind, and in many autistic individuals' minds, that is one of the top barriers to their access, their comfort, and their ability to be successful within spaces. And it's not about entirely mitigating and taking out acoustics from our spaces, but it's being mindful about not being gratuitous about it and being respectful about the acoustic environment and what noises in spaces and how we compartmentalize things and put things together and construct our zones and so on, just so we respect the flow of acoustics through space. The second construct is spatial sequencing. And spatial sequencing builds on this idea of predictability and bakes predictability into our designs. It builds on what 20 years ago we were trying to remove from the autistic life, which is this almost obsessive adherence to routine. And early on, when we didn't quite understand autism, it was one of the things that they used to say needs to be, quote unquote, unfortunately extinguished from the autistic life, that they needed to be more flexible and move out of their routine. What spatial sequencing does is completely celebrate that adherence to routine and use routine as a way to build comfort into the autistic user's sense of space. So it asks you to organize your spaces and zones in a way that's aligned almost exactly the way you want people to experience it. So it's almost like a director storyboarding a movie. So how you would lay out your spaces would be exactly in the same sequence that people would need to experience that building typology. The third concept is escape. And this is really essential because it's something that every autistic individual that I've ever met has created for themselves in their built worlds, in their built environments. And how we operationalize that and formalize that architecturally is call for creating what I call the escapescape, which is a whole network of spaces, like a whole ecosystem of places where people can retreat to when they are overloaded from the sensory environment. So there's sensory retreats that can be plugged in to any space, really. The next construct is the idea of compartmentalization, which is breaking our spaces down into manageable sensory pieces and respecting those boundaries. The boundaries don't have to be physical and very harsh. They can be softer and blurred, but it's about organizing spaces in sensory manageable pieces. The next construct is transition. And transition works with spatial sequencing in that as you move through your daily life from one experience, so it could be arriving to work from public transportation, and as you move from that experience in the outdoor city to your indoor experience in the workplace, transition is creating the architectural infrastructure to allow for that adjustment. It's to create these little pockets of space where people can adjust their sensory makeup and needs and regulate themselves before they're expected and to go into the very next activity. So it just makes that sequence of spaces a little more seamless and a little more kind and a little more nurturing as we move. Sensory zoning is about thinking about our spaces through the lens of senses. How stimulating is a space from high to low, and then organizing our spaces and our proxemics and the proximities of spaces with respect to those high-low stimulations. So grouping high stimulation together, low stimulation together. And I can talk about examples maybe in the Q&A. The final concept is safety, which of course is something that is quintessential and important whenever we're designing, but particularly when you're designing for vulnerable individuals. And very quickly, as part of the Autism Friendly University project that you mentioned in your intro, we did a second iteration of aspects that we call aspects 2.0. And that's where we talk about all the engineering of buildings that you mentioned: color, lighting, materials, furniture choices, concepts like wayfinding and navigation. And I'll show you an example of what we mean by that. And finally, technology and sensory economics and programming, which is how you operationalize then all these systems and make sure that what you've designed statically will operate and align dynamically when people occupy the space and start building in the systems on top of it. Moving on to one of the problems that I'm seeing that was really put into focus during the pandemic for all of us, which is this idea of the sensory as a commodity. And that example of how our worlds have become these canvases for commodification, and the sensory world of how they're lit, and musics and sounds and textures and colors and products and materials and crowds and movements and dynamics have just been up for sale. And so much of our spatial decisions are based on that dynamic of commodification. And the problem with that is not only is it overwhelming for every user, but it can be disabling for someone on the autism spectrum. And it could be the reason why someone is not only unhappy or uncomfortable or traumatized by a space, but is actually unable to occupy or even access that space. And the example you and I talked about earlier was the healthcare environment, that some of our hospitals are built in a way that their sensory environment is so harsh and so unwelcoming for many people, but particularly for individuals on the spectrum, to the extent that it's one of the reasons that individuals on the spectrum fail to get the healthcare that they need and have much poorer health statistically than many, many other populations to a degree. Yes.
Magda, let me interrupt you.
Sure.
What I hear you saying is that and I could be wrong, but it's what I'm hearing you say, is that healthcare can sometimes be almost avoided by an autistic because the confrontation with the design of a clinic, of a medical facility, of something could be actually more painful than the health problem that they're dealing with.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. But I can't say that the built environment is the only factor. There are other factors to that. It is one of. And some research coming out of a group called Autistica, that is a self-advocacy group of individuals that themselves are autistic, have identified the built environment of healthcare spaces as one of the top 3 reasons why healthcare is avoided in autistic individuals. This study was done in the UK.
Thanks for letting me interrupt. Thank you.
Sure, no, not at all. So it's actually a perfect time to interrupt, because I'm now going to move into the more practical solutions of examples, and beginning with healthcare specifically. So this was a project that I had the privilege to work with Alta Studios, that is a US-based leader in healthcare space design. It's the University of Nebraska Medical Center's Monroe Meyer Institute. And I worked with them to think about how we can bring the aspects principle into the design of this medical center that caters for individuals with developmental disabilities in addition to autistic patients. And a couple of things that we did is I was able with them to push our agenda beyond just the spaces that would cater for the autistic patients and the autistic individuals that would use the space, to spill over to all the spaces. So even the office spaces, the graduate student spaces were designed with some of the aspects principles in mind, because statistically, there's no reason why you wouldn't have a neurodiverse student population or a neurodiverse staff population that could themselves, a doctor or a nurse or a grad student, be on the spectrum of needs. And you see on the right, these AXO plans where you have the sensory zoning. The red is the high stimulation spaces like the physio and the sports and the occupational therapy. And then the yellow is the low stimulation where you have the clinics and the quieter zones. And where we found collisions between them, we created these points of transition that you see on your left, these escape spaces that were sprinkled throughout the wayfinding and navigation system throughout the medical center. The next example, which is also a healthcare space, I was invited by the wonderful Abe Rogers, who is a London-based architect who recently won the Wolfson Economics Prize for planning the hospital of the future. And he convened an amazing group of healthcare practitioners, patients, teachers, social workers, myself, and designers to think about what the hospital of the future should look like. And I was able to, on his kind invitation, bring to them my thoughts on healthcare and accessibility from the perspective of autism and neurodiversity, how we can be more inclusive of the autistic voice, how we can adopt some of the aspects, principles in designing things, like how we can sequence the spaces of a hospital to make them more welcoming, how we can create an escapescape throughout the hospital to allow patients to retreat to, and so on and so forth. And these kinds of principles are already being used. There's one example in Ireland, the Autism Friendly Hospital Initiative, that's using some aspects principles that's been very successful. This project is the one you talked about, the higher ed Dublin City University. And I see higher education spaces as like this microcosm of our cities. And what's interesting is that by creating these autism friendly spaces, we do what I call reverse inclusion. We create spaces that are designed with the autistic need in mind first and designed for autistic users first, but then made accessible to all students and all community on campus. And the hope is that when you have these kinds of spaces that are just so beautiful and comfortable and wonderful escapes from the daily life of campus, that it will help flip the stigma of seeing autism as a disability to seeing it maybe as a strength or something that is appealing, or to start removing and blurring the boundaries of that stigma. We also thought of the dorms on campus as part of the well-being of students. Mental health has become a crisis on our higher ed campuses. Student numbers are shocking on how poor their mental health is right now because of the pandemic. And we tried to build principles that I think in design would help all students, but that are done specifically for the autism students on campus. And this is an example of that escapescape network across the entire campus, and a few of the plugins of those escapescapes across campus. And the final example is through intersectional work that I'm doing with mixed design that looks at different abilities and different groups like deafness, blindness, autism, wheelchair users, different ages and genders in a residential college at an Ivy League that we are currently designing. And it takes the typical cross-section of a wayfinding space and an entry vestibule of this residential campus as a case study to show how we can create one design solution that will cater for all of these needs at the same time seamlessly, but will also benefit different populations. So although a space may be created with the ASD need in mind, it works good for deaf signers because it has that quiet space or that neutral visual background that will allow them to engage more carefully or more effectively. And I'll just close with this autism as expert, because I think it's really important to highlight and showcase the autistic perspective as expertise. These are images of a coping mechanism one of the first young boys I worked with used to understand the visual environment. He used silhouette, shadow, and outline and reflection as a way to track the world around him. And that was his strategy. And we discovered that through a photography exercise that he was given to photograph different objects, and realized he was actually photographing their silhouettes and shadows and not the objects themselves. This next strategy came from a young woman at Dublin City University who was using the back alleys behind the buildings of the campus as opposed to the central axis and central quad, so that she could escape from the noise of that space and the overstimulation of that space. And we used that strategy and completely revamped that whole back alley and made it a seamless, more effective wayfinding system. And we call it the Milena, we named it after her, the Milena sensory pathway. So it's giving this alternative that's quieter, that has these escape spaces. Not everyone has to go walking through a mall with bands and music and food and cheerleaders and lots of activity. There could be an alternative to that kind of experience on campus to allow you to get from point A to point B. And this final artist is an Irish artist by the name of Stuart Nielsen, who himself is autistic and was showcased at my Venice Biennale show. And when he went to visit the show at the Palazzo Bembo, of course, Venice is very overwhelming. The Biennale is very overwhelming. And he also used, interestingly, photography to compress and understand his spaces and the experience in these multisensory experiences that he has. And this final video that I'll leave you with is also Stuart's, that was created during the pandemic. It's a GoPro camera on his window that he used to photograph the movement of seagulls across his city. And what he uncovered by doing this brilliant video montage editing that he does is that the movement of the birds was mirroring the street network of the city below, which was a really interesting discovery that only the autistic mind could have possibly found out. So I will close here. If anyone wants to take a screenshot, these are the QR codes to some of the references. I'm happy to share them with Dave and Laura and the team if anyone is interested in reading more about some of the references that I talked about.
Leave that up just a second for people that are scrambling to pick up their phone right now. That is just, I'm telling you, I feel like I just got hit with a fire hose of insight, right? It's just amazing what you just brought to us.
Well, I'm sorry to hit you with the fire hose, Dave, but thank you.
No, that's a good thing. It's a good thing. There's sometimes being overwhelmed is a good thing as opposed to bored, right? You're anything but boring. That's for sure. Okay, why don't you stop sharing your screen and you and I will jump up here for a second. That's just unbelievable. I just think, I'm wondering why it is, and it's probably like all things in our life where we don't have broad enough perspective. At the end of the day, everyone who is a healthcare design professional, I was thinking of this in relation to healthcare centers and hospitals, needs to go through a set of courses of using this aspects work to better inform their design. You could do that for, as you said, retail places, any place where humans gather, where there are alternatives for passage. Not everyone needs to be assaulted with noise and sight and movement all the time. Some of us actually enjoy quiet and
it's nice to have the choice. I mean, I think one of the things we do is we assume one user, one experience. I think each of us, autistic, neurotypical, neurodiverse, whoever, we need the choice to be able to navigate our spaces in the way that is suitable for the sensory needs that we have at any given time, especially when it comes to something critical like healthcare or, I don't know, public transportation, things that are just crucial, and education and learning spaces.
At the bottom of your screen, everybody who's watching this, if you have questions that you want to ask Magda, if you could pose those questions there, or some insights, or just some, oh my gosh, that would be fine too as we move down through this. So do you see a difference in the way that design in this space is approached regionally? In other words, is there a different sensitivity to this on the European continent versus North America versus other parts of the world?
Well, definitely. I mean, I'm very privileged to be able to work all over the world, from the Gulf to California, Asia. I mean, I have partners and projects that I've worked with and on everywhere. And there are a few things that are universal, and there are a few things that are very diverse. And one of the things that is universal is around the basic constructs of this autism as expertise. And I think that's really important. It's important to begin with the autistic voice first. The area where there's diversity is where certain regions of the world are. In that slide I showed that was talking about the medical model versus the functional model and the social model and the cultural model. So different places in the world are still in the medical model and still think of everything related to autistic and autism spectrum support as therapy or as medical care. I designed, without disclosing necessarily country names or project names, but I designed a project for autism, for autistic children, that was basically a school, but it was called a hospital. And it was basically teachers, but they were all called therapists and doctors. So I was designing it as a school, and I knew that it would operate as a school. And I knew that hopefully if it was successful, children will come out of it having learned something, but the model through which it was being framed. And also what really informs that is policy and just governance structures. So where autistic needs and how they're being supported and delivered, is it seen as, so there are autistic needs in the United States, for example, that are supported by health insurance, and that makes it under the medical model. And then there's pieces of it that's education, and that's under learning and social support. And then as children get older, maybe it's employment and more job support and or social work. So the governance structure of responsibilities and how it operates also really informs geographically just how these things are set up. So for example, in the UK, that has public health care, the NHS plays a big role in informing, or the NAS, it's very centralized. And I think it depends, it's just all one big, it's all interconnected, but the better you understand it, and I think it's important to understand it, because you can then navigate and be effective. Because if you come in with one model, when the place where you're operating is operating with a different model, you won't be effective. You really have to understand how it works to be able to navigate it with impact.
The work we're watching in the United States, we're watching an explosion. It's been happening for a little over a year, coming out of the 2020 awfulness. The 2021 market for K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade, schools and institutions have just exploded. There's more work than the available architects that do that work can possibly handle. And of course, what we saw is that local communities, parents, schools, school boards, they all wanted to create new spaces that were more adaptive, more flexible,
right?
Had more openness to the outside and the inside, that there was more adaptability to be able to flip the building around and become a healthcare building or more than just a school. And how critical it would be if we could now take this consciousness that you brought to us and now incorporate that, because my guess is, and you probably have more facts on this, is that there are so many undiagnosed autistics in public schools who are assaulted daily to one degree or another because they can't handle what's happening, by what's happening there. And they haven't been maybe taught or have the monetary means to be able to be taught how to cope, like some of the examples of the students that you gave who are using photography and drawing and other ways to deal with this, and how critical it would be if the design community working within the school context could now not just design another good school, but design a much better school with this awareness in mind. I mean, when I say that it's exploding, there are so many projects on the boards right now just in this space. It's unprecedented. We've not seen this much, and I just don't want the design community to miss this opportunity, I guess is the point.
I mean, I agree with you. I think it's really interesting. My work began in the learning environment, and I think that's where you can have the biggest impact when you rethink learning spaces. And when you talked about diagnosis and lack of diagnosis, really that diagnostic line is a man-made line. It's a line that someone decided somewhere on some checklist, this is where it sits, right? So autistic, non-autistic, typical, atypical. So just like we put it, we can blur it, we can shift it. But I think what's more important is for us to think of every student, every teacher, every parent's experiences somewhere on that spectrum of sensory need, and just design with a higher sensory awareness of our school environment, create that gradient of opportunity, like a whole palette of sensory opportunities within our school systems and our school spaces, create that escape network for everyone, because everyone, whether it's an overwhelming feeling that is triggered by your autism or triggered by something else, that need to retreat, that need to have that predictability to your space, that's supportive for everyone's learning, because it frees your bandwidth from the anxiety of just being in the physical space to focus on learning. And that's what I think our role as architects is to clear out the mental space for our students so they can focus on what they need to be doing, which is learning, and for our teachers so that they can focus on the teaching that they need to be doing, as opposed to the anxieties that our physical environment is bringing to them. And it's interesting you're saying this explosion around school environments. One of my collaborators, Professor Joel Sanders, and Joel is a professor at Yale, and he and I have been working for 4 semesters now on a studio that he teaches there around inclusive design. And we always partner with institutional partners. And in the past, we've been partnering with museums, and our students and his students and I've been coming in, and we hope to formalize this where I'll be a bigger part of this studio, but we've been bringing in guests and so on. But one of the areas that we're interested in exploring could potentially be in the future, school environments. So we're aware of this explosion of interest, and similar to the explosion that's happening in the workplace environments, that people are capitalizing on the COVID new normal and the gap of time we had when we didn't have people in schools and we didn't have people in offices. I think all institutions are rethinking, how can we come back more effectively, having reflected on the period of time when we were away, and come back in a way that's just more impactful. And if I can say anything, it's about just designing with more sensory respect and sensory awareness in what we're building into our school environments and our learning environments or our healthcare environments. When we make these sensory design decisions, we really have to feel the responsibility of that.
It's just fantastic. Our mutual friend, Luis Rico Gutierrez, who is the dean at Iowa State University over all the design disciplines there, asked this question. Magda, you talked about the challenges that exist in our built environment. Can we apply this framework widely at the scale of the city? And what are the low-hanging fruit that might be there, and which elements of the framework are more challenging for urban designers and planners?
I mean, as usual, Luis has brilliant questions and insight and has a very intelligent take on things. I actually just wrote an article, it's about to be published soon, called The Autism Friendly City, where I take the aspects framework and apply it to the level of the city. But just practically speaking, some of the spaces that we can really have impact. One of the areas I would like to see aspects thinking and the sensory thinking be implemented is in our public transportation infrastructure. So right now, as our cities are thankfully becoming, our institutions are becoming more autism friendly and autism aware. So you have more accessible schools, more accessible workplaces, maybe more accessible service providers. But these are what I call islands of accessibility in a sea of inaccessibility. And you're only as strong as your weakest link. If a student or an employee can't get from their home from their accessible home to their accessible workplace without being, like you said, assaulted by the sensory failures of our cities, then what are we really achieving? So, and we're creating these anxieties. One of the things we did at the Autism Friendly University was to create on-campus housing, because one of the reasons autistic students were struggling so much was because they'd found accessible housing that was very expensive, but was available to them off campus. And to be able to get on campus, that commute just completely disrupted their day because of public transportation. So I think our public transportation infrastructure is a space, and it's one of those spaces that's hyper sensory commodified. As a colleague and I were talking about, it's like this sensory colonization. Our spaces have been colonized by the capitalist world of advertising and noise and music and color and billboards, and there's nowhere where that's more apparent than our transportation infrastructures. So if that is one of the things, if we can be more mindful of I know in Europe they have like quiet train cars. That's like just a drop in the bucket, but it's one thing that you can do. And I just want to double down on this because it's so important. And I'll tell you one experience. I was presenting at the United Nations Commission for the Rights of People with Disabilities. We were presenting aspects as a strategy that they would possibly codify as part of the things that their signatories would take into consideration in design. And I was there with two autistic gentlemen who kindly invited me to, they shared their platform with me, basically, of this audience that they had spent 2.5 years trying to get with the United Nations Commission. And they were just so proud of this opportunity. And when we got there, one of them was unable to come because when he left his home that morning to get on a train in Switzerland, which has one of the best and most organized train systems in the world, it was just so overwhelming for him, and he had to go back, and he didn't come to this meeting that he'd been dreaming of for 2.5 years because public transportation was just so overwhelming for him, and he couldn't participate in something that was really important. And there are just so many other examples from experiences I've had with people that just cannot function as well as I know they're capable, and they have demonstrated they're capable of, because they're put in a sensory environment that just doesn't match with their needs.
Magda, Kim Montague, who is an executive at Kimball International, a wonderful human, writes to you, bravo. We need to continue to push the boundaries and challenge the status quo in educational environments and health and workplace. I love the term available versus inclusive. Thank you for all the work you're doing, Magda. So fantastic. And we just want to say thank you for joining us this evening. It's almost 8 o'clock your time. Thanks for, you're just so full of life. And thank you for bringing your life to us during this period.
Thank you, Dave. And thank you, Kim, for your kind words. I mean, I'm happy to connect if there's any interest to have further conversations with anyone. I'm sure Dave can put us in touch with one another.
We will be pushing your contact out to everyone, because what you're doing is so critical. And we literally have thousands of people in our community of the Design Futures Council who need to hear what you are saying. And we need to talk more about how to get this message out to them.
Well, I look forward to it, Dave. Thank you so much.
All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.